canvas, and my hand sticks to the paper, drops of sweat muddying the charcoal. The same warehouse that floods in the winter, so that even in these unbearably hot days, I don't dare romanticize the cold lest I forget the nights wading through puddles, and the 2 pairs of pants and socks, and the paint that never seems to dry.
Okay, good. Okay, this is an interview with Maceo Montoya, Los Angeles, California, Wednesday, September 22nd. And let me first of all begin, and you can just make eye contact with me.
Okay.
Tell me a little bit about your background. Where were you born, and where did you grow up, and where did you go to school?
All right. I was born in Oakland, California, but my parents moved to a small town, Elmira, California, a town of 300 people, 60 houses in the middle of agricultural country, and I spent the first 18 years of my life there. I come from a family of artists. My father, Maceo Montoya, is a painter, a printmaker, a muralist, and also an educator and an activist. My tío Jose is a poet and a musician and also an artist. My brother, eldest brother, Andres Montoya, was a poet. He passed away, but his collection, The Ice Worker Sings, and other poems had a big influence on me. I went to school at Yale University, and I studied history, and I got my Master of Fine Arts in painting at Columbia University in 2006.
Before we get into the writing, tell me a little bit about your artistic work. What has inspired it? And I noticed, just looking at some of the slides that you showed me, that it's informed, I would say, by your father's work, although it has its own distinct presence. Tell me about how you've come to your present style of work.
Well, I consider myself a narrative painter. Telling stories, and whether it's an individual portrait or an elaborate composition, that's always the element that's most important, what story is being told. And so it lended itself to the writing, which eventually emerged from the paintings. As I started working in series of works, there was a long series of paintings in Knight's Landing, which I moved after I graduated from college. Just wanted to go find another small town and hole up and paint. And I realized as I showed the paintings to different members of the community that they had stories that went along with these characters, with these figures, and I wanted to include those details somehow. And what started as long titles became short vignettes, then short stories, and then I weaved those together into my first attempt at a novel. And so even though the painting, I guess, came first, the story was the most important element, and so I always considered it, whatever form I'm trying to convey a story.
Another way of saying it might be that, and if you could incorporate my questions in your answer.
Yeah.
In what ways are you fundamentally a storyteller, and the medium is kind of a secondary aspect of what you put to use to tell your story?
How would I rephrase that?
Or just the thing about the storytelling, that you're basically a storyteller?
Yeah. I feel like I have different voices, and those voices, whether it's conveyed through the painting, will have a different mark, and whether I'm working in some sort of like prose poetry, will have a different voice, as well as if I'm writing fiction. And I think that's definitely in the tradition of my father's work, my uncle's work. As I said, that even though my father is primarily a visual artist, he's also a pretty incredible storyteller. My uncle, his work, I think crossing mediums is definitely, it's storytelling is what's most fundamental, and in the whatever medium is chosen is almost secondary. Although the chosen medium, I think, definitely has leaves a different mark.
Let me hold you right there. I just want to test the sound and make sure you're okay. I don't know. I want to make sure I'm not scaring my dog. Does it say something like that?
My name is Maceo Montoya. Grew up in Elmira, California. I'm here in Los Angeles.
Okay, say something else.
My name is Maceo Montoya. I'm here in Los Angeles, September 22nd, 2010.
Okay. That's good. Trying to get, not get all this noise. Okay. So let's continue. How long have you been painting?
I've been painting and drawing pretty much all my life. I guess the serious focus began once I graduated from undergrad. And in studying history, my second major was ethnicity, race, and migration. And I was fascinated with the study, with learning these stories. And it was always the documentation that I had issue with. I just found that the academic papers just wasn't very satisfying. And so when I moved to Knights Landing and started learning the stories of this community and played on a soccer team with a whole bunch of guys that were from Michoacan, and they were undocumented workers, and they were telling me their stories, and I was also talking about my work and what my intention was, and then I would go and I would write either these vignettes or these short stories. I would have these paintings that were documents of their life, and yet it was fiction. I was creating, I was making it up, and based on these details, but it just felt much more satisfying as a record of what I was experiencing, being able to depart from the actual facts.
What, in addition to your uncle, that has a huge body of prose and poetry, what other literary people have influenced your writing, do you think, or do you feel have influenced your craft who are Latino?
Latino.
Or not even Latino, just whoever may have influenced your writing.
A few authors. It's hard to say the authors that have influenced my work, because it's almost like a writer will influence a particular book or the way that a story develops. There was a while where I was going back and forth between Dostoevsky and Garcia Marquez. Very different writers, very different styles, very different intentions, and yet there was something about those voices that resonated within me, and I guess, again, back to the importance of my family in the development of my work. That almost I see as more of an influence than picking out any other specific literary figures. Just because the literary influences, they influence the craft, the structure, whereas you can't really stray from the stories that you've grown up with your entire life. And my grandmother was a storyteller. Even the fact that she told the same story over and over and over, but for some reason you never tired of hearing it. And the same thing with my father, and sitting around the table hearing the stories of his childhood, and hearing them over and over again, and it becomes part of, it grows, this body of stories that form who you are, and it can't help but emerge once you start telling your own stories.
Tell me about your writing process.
I have a pretty structured schedule. I wake up and I start writing almost immediately in the morning. Depending on the novel, I'll have a word count, whether it's 1,000 words or 2,000 words. In the case of The Scoundrel and the Optimist, because I wanted it to be a more structured work, it ended up being, I set up a chapter a day, and each chapter is about 1,000 words.
Tell me about that, your first novel. How did that come about?
I was in grad school, and I was reading different articles on deaths in the border. As the increased border vigilance, and this is probably about mid-2000s, it was pushing immigrants to find even more dangerous ways of crossing. It was a specific article on the bodies that were found in the desert, and this horrifying stuff that I wanted to represent in a series of paintings. And there was one line in particular in this article that mentioned a 14-year-old boy that was found in the desert next to his dead father. And there was something about the brevity of the line that just really, it had a big impact on me, because it lended itself to the opening up of this much broader story. What was going through this boy's mind? How would this moment, his father dying next to him in the desert, how would it affect the kind of man that he became? And what led them to that point? And these were all questions that were going on as I was trying to represent it visually in a painting. So I finished the painting, and I was surprised at the response by my fellow students in the graduate program, the professors, and it was mainly just a lack of empathy, indifference. This was a story that they heard before. This was a story that had been told visually by Diego Rivera, Siqueiros. It was bringing nothing new. And I couldn't insist, no, this isn't a story that's heard before, this is a specific story. And so I felt, I had to find another way of telling this story. I had to find another way of fleshing out these ideas that would grab even the most indifferent of viewers, or in this case, when I started writing the story, of readers. So for a couple years, I thought about it, and the story, The Scoundrel and the Optimist, it's a humorous story. It's told in a very lighthearted way, and yet it emerged from this very dark and disturbing story of this young boy and his dead father.
Who is the optimist, and who is the scoundrel?
The optimist is the young protagonist, Edmund, and his father is the scoundrel, Filastro. The book was originally called Filastro and Edmund, but as I started to view their stories and the contrast that were set up, and realized that there was this dichotomy that needed to somehow be represented, and it is the relationship of a father and son, and one by one, Edmund's brothers and sisters leave for the United States to escape their abusive father, and he is completely oblivious to everything that's going on around him. His main concern is pursuing this girl that he has a crush on, Ingrid Hinera, and I think that's where the humor comes in. It's like there's all these dark, disturbing events, this very tragic story that's occurring, and yet all he's focused on is just growing up and love, and just his daily preoccupations, and that ties itself back to the storytelling method of my father, my uncle, who lived very difficult childhoods, and yet whenever they tell a story about their own abusive father or their own difficulties working in the fields or having to watch their mother work all day and to be treated so horribly by her husband, all those stories are told to entertain, to bring humor into it, and I realized that was the difference between the initial dark, somber painting and the story that eventually emerged. Was I wanted to tell a story that was entertaining, but also to engage the reader in this humorous story, while at the same time as the tragedies of life are ongoing.
What has been the response so far from on the
It's been very, very positive, and I think people have
incorporate my question.
Oh, I'm sorry. The response to the novel has been very positive, and I think that people do respond to its lightheartedness, to the humor, and are also very surprised by the dark undertones, by the tragedy that does occur, and I think people would hope that the outcome would somehow be different, and yet I don't think it would be. It wouldn't be a story that would interest me if there hadn't been that tragic outcome. If there wasn't somehow this underlying somber story, because I want the reader to somehow empathize with this experience and the difficulties of growing up in a town when there aren't any opportunities, where the shame and the lack of any way out leads to figures like the scoundrel, like Filastro, who just has this anger within him that he takes out on his wife, on his children, and you wonder what's going to come of Edmund, the young protagonist. Will he eventually turn into his father? Will he lose that optimism? Will the shame somehow, overcome him? And that's why it's important. It's why that story is important.
Let me just. We're doing good. All right. So. You're an artist, but you're an author, and but you're fundamentally a storyteller. What do you think is in the future for you in terms of where you're going to direct your skills? Do you think you're going to continue to do more art or more writing, or is it going to be a combination?
I feel that the future of the combination of both writing fiction and painting, that they'll have to continue together. It's like one is informing the other. They're always in dialogue with one another. I'm always trying to find ways of incorporating my paintings into prose, or finding even new mediums. I'm combining the two, where there's paintings that are viewed while somehow that the viewer has access to the narrative that goes along with it. And I've tried to let one or the other go for periods of time, and I feel that both are fundamental to my creative process. And even though there's periods where I'm more focused, say on completing a novel, it's necessary that I also have that outlet, that I'm telling these other stories, and because the expression feels different, the process is very different. With painting, it's much more guttural and I guess expressionistic than the writing, which the process is more labored, and it could take years to get a novel to a point where it's finished, whereas a painting, although it can take a very long time to complete, its initial energy was done within the first couple of days or weeks of working on it.
Now, you've taken some of the inspiration, some of the visuals that inspired you to write the novel, and you've done this slideshow. Tell me how that came about, why you prefer that, or why you felt compelled to do it, and then we'll get into the reading.
Whenever I'm painting, and this is long even before I started writing, I'm thinking of the story that's going on, and especially because my focus is the human figure, and particularly portraits, and you can't help when creating this person, because most of the portraits just come from my head. Every now and then I'll use some sort of photo resource, but for the most part, it's organic. It just emerges out of nowhere as I'm working on the portrait, and you see an expression, and that expression leads to what is he thinking, what is his story, and for the most part, those stories aren't ever recorded. They're not documented. They just hopefully are imbued within the painting itself. And in this case, I'm working on these series of works. I decided that these stories that are ongoing in my head, I needed to somehow to document them, and that's one way that I've been able to combine both the prose and the visual element. In I think, or I hope, an effective manner, telling one story, but with these, combining these different mediums, in much the same way I guess that a filmmaker would feel, combining music and cinematography and the language, it's all these different elements to tell a story, to have one end.
Okay, good. Why don't we do the reading? And I'm going to, if you'll just, when you look up, if you can do here, and one of the things that I would advise, this happens a lot with readers, is it's this. So if you could make eye contact every now and then to write about here.
Okay.
And then I'm going to ride the camera here. So. And you might ID this at the very beginning.
Okay. This is Cielo Rojo, 2009. I'm sorry, I'm starting?
That's good.
Okay. Cielo Rojo, 2009. They keep coming to my studio, the panaderia warehouse off of East that smells of... start over.
Yeah, if there's a break, just take a beat.
Okay. Cielo Rojo, 2009. They keep coming to my studio, the panaderia warehouse off of East that smells of flour and sugar crusted on baking racks. The warehouse so hot in the summer that the paint seems to dry before the brush touches the canvas, and my hand sticks to the paper, drops of sweat muddying the charcoal. The same warehouse that floods in the winter, so that even in these unbearably hot days, I don't dare romanticize the cold, lest I forget the nights wading through puddles, and the 2 pairs of pants and socks, and the paint that never seemed to dry. They keep coming to my studio in the panaderia warehouse off of East, rapping on the metal curtain as if they can see my illuminated corner, as if they know that there is a painter in a warehouse, imagining himself as a painter in a warehouse, already writing his solitary story. They keep coming, rapping on the metal curtain until I open the door, expecting it just to be the sounds of night never heard during the day, like the creak of a swiveling vent. But they are there, more shadows than men, like the one on that first night who stood there in the moonless darkness and said to me without preliminaries, "Cuánto me cobras? How much will you charge?" "Charge you for what?" I said. And he responded, "I keep dreaming that I'm going toward a blue sky, but when I awake, it's always red. The sky is red, don't you understand?" And after a pause, he said again, "Cuánto me cobras?" And I told him that he must be mistaken. "I just used this warehouse," I said. "Who is it that sent you?" And he shook his head as if I were the one mistaken and said, "Don't you see? I keep expecting the sky to be blue, but it's always red." And before I could tell him again that I didn't understand, he continued, insisting on being heard, on being understood. "I came here years ago," he said. "I came here with dreams, don't you see? I came here believing the stories I'd heard, that one day I would be my own boss, have my own business, my own house, and that I would be able to tell my children, 'Sí, mijos,' my hand drawing an invisible line in the air. This is what I was then. This is what I am now. How much will you charge me?" And I said again, "I don't understand. Charge you for what? What is it that you want?" And he shook his head in agitation. "It's just that every time I walk outside, I expect the sky to be blue, but it's always red, don't you see?" And without waiting for me to say no, he began again. "I hurt my back," he said. "I can't work. I can't work. What is a man who can't work? I'm not a man anymore. I used to have dreams, that's when I was a man. But now, mi mujer, my wife, my woman, don't you see? My wife, And he kept on saying, mi mujer, over and over again, as if that was the only way to explain. He looked down at the ground and then just as quickly looked up and said, I can't even shit, ni cagar. And he laughed, a hysterical laugh not meant to emerge. So now you see, he said, now you see. How much will you charge? And this time it was my turn to laugh unexpectedly. Señor, I don't understand what you're asking of me. Listen, he said, listen. I used to think I was heading toward a blue sky and that it just happened to be red. But now I know. Now I know there is no blue sky that I'm heading toward. The sky is always red. El cielo es rojo. I know that now. I'm 43 years old, and I've never been anything in my life, and now I know for sure that I never will be. How much will you charge? And this time, my impatience tempered, but not my confusion. I said, please, charge you for what? And this time he said, para expresar que me siento, to express what I feel right here. And he pointed to the middle of his chest, just above his abdomen. Here, he said again, here. And the others followed. Nights later, I again heard the rapping on the metal curtain, and I opened the door, and there he was. And nights later, there she was, in the same moonless darkness, ready to ask me the same question, how much will you charge? And providing the same answers to my confusion. Don't you see, I keep expecting the sky to be blue, but it's always red. And they tell me of the same heartbreaks and betrayals. They tell me of the same dreams never realized, and they tell me of the same regrets. Only the details change, names, locations. It's like the old song, one of them said, giving me finally some semblance of context. The song that goes, voy caminando, I go walking, y no sé qué hacer, and I don't know what to do. Ni el cielo me contesta, and the sky does not answer me. Mientras estoy durmiendo, while I'm sleeping, I dream that the two of us together are heading toward a blue sky, but when I awake, the sky is red, and you are gone. And he held his hand to his heart and said, here. Just as one pointed to her temple, and another to his jaw, another to her upper abdomen, and another just below his stomach. Here, they said, this is where I feel it. ¿Cuánto me cobras para expresar que me siento aquí? Here.
Excellent. Good. I just wanted to get